Congratulations if you've got this far in this tutorial. You must be sick of the sound of my voice. I've been editing it as I go along, and I'm sick of the sound of my own voice. But to end, I'm going to talk about the uses of Cloner. And to start with, I'm going to have a breakdown of this. This is a copy of a piece of motion graphics I saw at the cinema. There's an advertising company called Pearl & Dean in the UK. And this is the current animation they have before and after adverts are shown at the cinema. There are probably other ways of doing this, but this is the way I did it. I didn't actually think I was going to have to explain it, so it might be a little disjointed, and there are probably better ways of doing, even with Cloner, some of the things I'm going to show. But it gives you an idea of the sort of things you can do with Cloner. So here we are in Fusion. Here's the flow. It's not that complicated. First thing I'm going to do, you may notice that a lot of these cloners have motion blur. This is to create this blurry effect. But to speed up the viewport, I'm going to turn that off. So now we don't have motion blur on those nodes. So let's begin over here. So obviously we're starting with a background with an ellipse mask to create a circle. That circle is then put in this cloner, which is just a grid cloner of 9 by 1. Could have been done linearly, but it was just easier to just have a grid of, I knew that I wasn't going to adjust the line, so a grid worked fine. And this one, you notice the circles fade in and then fade out. Now this is done with a color effector, which is this, which is just a background with an animated rectangular mask. So the mask comes in and then goes out again. And that's the color effector of this grid. So it fades the circles in and then out. Now you may wonder why I'm using this color effector as opposed to the built-in blend. Well, if you notice, the blend is a very gradual fade from one to the end, whereas I wanted a much harder transition from visible to invisible. So that's why I was using a color effector. And the cloner is this shape because I knew I was going to clone this cloner, because that's one of the techniques of using it. You can animate one thing with one cloner and then clone that in another cloner. We take this cloner and we put it in another cloner, which is here, which is, again, I'm using a grid, a 1 by 5, so it's 5 rows. And if we watch what happened there, you see that each row is mirrored. And the way I did this was just change the angle to 180 degrees. So each clone of the cloner was rotated 180 degrees. And so you get this effect of the animation. And moving on to this merge, this is used to fade in the first of the rings. And I think I'm just using the blend animated to fade in one of the rings. Now this ring, again, we've got a background which has got an ellipse on it, and here's the ellipse. And this is a radial cloner, and there's quite a lot of keyframes on this one, so let's have a look at those. So the radius, I notice there's a keyframe there, is increasing. So there's the radius animated, and then further on, it gets animated again. And then the radial offset is done to turn it. Turn it again, and then the radius is animated again off screen. So looking at that merge, this fade in here was just to fade in the beginning of this ring, which is that, on top of this grid of circles, which of course is another cloner. Moving on, we've got another merge, which is another fade in, probably this second circle, which is another radial cloner with various animation. In this case, I am using the blend effect to fade it in as the radius is increasing. Again, it's changing. We're using the radial offset. And then I guess it gets faded out probably by this particular merge node. And again, we've got another similar sort of thing, a radial cloner, which fades in, rotates, the radius shrinks again, so it's back to like a circle. And then this merge is almost certainly the same sort of thing. That's another radial cloner of a circle. Yeah, so basically the combination of those multiple radial cloners, which are all merged together, you get this effect. So looking at the next merge, these are some big circles that expand like that. And that is done using a grid cloner. I may sound surprised because I'm trying to remember how I did this. So it's a grid cloner and the X size is animated and then the Y size is animated to create that effect. But there's also, that is merged with just a circle that is doing nothing apart from it shrinks down, which actually is shrinking down because I'm using the same ellipse for the background that I'm cloning here. And this is the center one. So now we look, when they're together, they shrink down at an earlier stage, and that then goes to nothing. So the next stage, we have another merge, which is merging this thing, which is quite a complicated looking thing. So what's happening here? Let's have a look. So that center circle shrinks down, and then another row of circles fades up. And that's done using the blend on this merge. So let's have a look at this circle row. And that is another grid cloner of a circle with a color effector, and that color effector is doing that. So as that fades in, the alpha of each of those circles are being controlled by this color effector. And then, so that creates that. And that's also put in another grid, a grid of 3. So we've got 3 of that. And then that's affected by another color effector, which is doing, that is fading in. So this grid of those rows, the color effector there is changing the vertical fade, and then that's in another grid where the horizontal fade is controlled with this one. So as you see, they sort of fade in and up at the same time. That is then transformed and mirrored, so we get the effect looking like that. That, of course, is merged with the one from earlier, the first one. I had to look at this again and work out what was happening with this rather complicated setup here. But basically, these are various gradients that are animated and then mixed together and merged and then inverted at one point to create different effects at different times. So if we look at this, which is the color effector, we see it starts off as a very thin line, expands, expands, and then shrinks back down again to a single, very thin line in the middle, which is affecting this row. But at the same time, either this ellipse, this background, is this animated? Yeah, this background is animated, so it shrinks. And so if you notice that that one's a solid and there's some very slight transparency there, which is controlled by this color effector. And all of that creates that. And then as you see, the first one fades out, which is probably controlled by this merge. Yep. And then the other ones shrink down because of the scaling of this background. And then there's just another merge, which is the circle, which fades in and then shrinks and then does a bit of a animation to spin it, to sort of fake spin round, which gives the effect. So you can see, even I, who created this, I'm having difficult remembering what it all does, but by mixing effectors, gradients, cloning cloners, that sort of thing, you can get some really quite complicated effects.